So
Yeah.
get it. We're going deep today into a story about the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah.
But with a twist, I bet you've never heard of this guy.
Yeah, most people haven't.
It's Casper Holstein.
And what makes Holstein so interesting is he's not the typical artist or writer we associate with that period.
Right.
His story goes way deeper, gets into the underbelly of Harlem.
And the crazy part, we're starting with just his Wikipedia page. Who knew Wikipedia could be so, dramatic?
You'd be surprised how much is hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to dig a little.
Okay, so let's set the stage. It's 1877, the island of St. Croix.
Which back then, get this, was part of the Danish West Indies.
Whoa, okay. Already a mix of cultures right from the start.
Yeah, and this guy, Casper Holstein, is born into this world.
Talk about complexity.
And it's a time of huge change, too. The whole world's changing. Think about it. The Industrial Revolution, people moving everywhere. For a young black man born in St. Croix, that had to be, well, a lot to deal with.
And then 7 years later, boom, he moves to New York City with his mom. That's a huge jump from a Caribbean island to the biggest city in America.
New York in the late 1800s, talk about a melting pot. So much opportunity, but also a lot of poverty, too.
And it's here that Casper starts to make his mark. But here's the thing.
His early jobs are kind of surprising.
What do you mean?
Well, he worked as a janitor, a doorman, even a messenger.
Wait, hold on. The guy who becomes a major player in Harlem, he starts as a doorman.
Yep, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, now I got to know how that happens. How do you go from opening doors to, running a criminal empire?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And it says a lot about who Holstein was, the chances he had, but also the limits he faced. Because let's be real, being black in America back then, that wasn't easy.
Not at all.
So walk me through it. How does he become, what was it, the Bolita King? What even is that?
Okay, so imagine the lottery, but instead of the state running it, it's gangsters.
Oh, okay. So this is serious stuff.
That was the Bolita, basically an illegal numbers racket, and Casper. He became the king of it.
I guess I could see how being a doorman, you might overhear things, see how money moves, maybe even make some connections.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
But still, we're talking about a huge jump. He wasn't just playing the game. He was running the whole thing.
Exactly. And not only that, he was making serious bank, like millions of dollars in the 20s and 30s.
Wait, millions? Back then?
Yeah, we're talking the equivalent of a tech billionaire today.
Oh, that kind of money, especially for a black man back then. That's not just about living large. That's about power.
You got it. That kind of wealth gives you influence, a voice in a system that was designed to silence people like him.
Man, this is getting good. So we've got our numbers, kingpin, tons of cash, power in Harlem.
But like any good story, there's got to be some conflict, right?
Right. Every king has his rivals. I'm guessing Holstein's no different.
You guessed it. We're talking organized crime, and there were some big names trying to muscle in. Oh, just guys like Dixie Davis, Dutch Schultz. These weren't small-time players.
So what happens? Was there a big gang war?
Well, things definitely got tense. A power struggle was brewing. But here's the thing about Holstein.
What's that?
Instead of going to war, he starts to back off, sees the violence getting out of hand, and steps away from it.
That's not exactly what you picture when you think gangster, huh?
Nope, not at all. Makes you wonder what was going through his head.
Yeah, was he scared? Or was there something else going on?
That's the beauty of this deep dive. We get to explore those questions and see if we can figure out the real Casper Holstein.
Okay, I'm hooked. So we've got our kingpin pulling back from the criminal world. But there's got to be more to the story, right? What's the twist?
Oh, there's definitely a twist coming. Remember all that money Holstein made? He didn't just keep it for himself.
Where's he spending it?
Get ready for this. He becomes a major supporter of, drum roll please, the Harlem Renaissance.
You're kidding, right? The numbers racket guy is funding artists.
That's right, and not just a little bit of money here and there.
Okay, now this is getting good. Tell me more.
We're talking big contributions, the kind that really shaped the Harlem Renaissance. He was funding dorms at black colleges, supporting artists, writers, even saving important institutions like the UNIA Hall from foreclosure.
Wow, so on one hand, illegal gambling. On the other, making sure black students have a place to live, artists have support. That's a pretty wild contradiction.
It definitely makes you rethink the idea of who a gangster is, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's like, who is this guy really?
That's what we're going to find out.
I'm in. Let's keep digging. So we've got this fascinating guy, this numbers kingpin, but also a big supporter of the Harlem Renaissance, like two sides of the same coin. And I'm really curious about the whole philanthropy thing. Like, how did he actually use his money to make a difference in Harlem?
Well, one of the most interesting examples is this place called Holstein Court. It was a building he built specifically for Black professionals, business owners, that sort of thing.
Interesting. And you said earlier he started out as a doorman. Do you think that experience, shaped this project?
It's hard not to see the connection, right? Imagine seeing firsthand how tough it was for Black professionals to find decent housing, especially in a city like New York, where segregation was still a big problem.
Yeah, makes you wonder if he saw this as a way to create opportunities that maybe he didn't have.
It adds a whole other layer to his story, doesn't it?
It's not just charity, it's about, social change.
Exactly. And it makes you think about his legacy. Was he trying to, make up for the way he made his money?
Or was it just genuine wanting to help his community no matter what?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. This guy is full of surprises. But it wasn't just housing, right? You mentioned education, too.
Oh, absolutely. Funding those dorms at Black colleges, that was huge back then.
Think about it. Access to education was so limited for Black Americans.
Holstein's support helped break down some of those barriers.
And each student who benefited, they probably went on to do amazing things. It's like a ripple effect spreading out from those dorms.
It really is powerful. And then there's the support for artists and writers. We don't know the specific names, but it makes you wonder who he helped, what kind of art did he like?
I can picture him, at a jazz club, surrounded by all these artists talking about art and politics.
It's a cool image, right?
Yeah, and it reminds you that history is not just facts and figures. It's real people living their lives, changing the world.
Exactly.
Okay, but we got to be honest here. We can't just ignore the illegal gambling. It's kind of a big deal, right?
You're right. We can't celebrate his good deeds without acknowledging where the money came from.
Yeah, it makes things complicated, ethically speaking.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to reconcile those two sides of Casper Holstein?
Yeah, it's the challenge, isn't it?
Part of you wants to say he was a criminal, but then you see the impact of his philanthropy. And it's like, wait a minute, maybe it's not that simple.
It really makes you think about how we define good and bad, especially when we're talking about history.
And it's not like we can judge the past by today's standards.
Exactly. We have to understand the context, the time period, the challenges people faced.
Speaking of challenges, can we talk about that kidnapping? 5 guys, a $50,000 ransom, and then he's released after 3 days, saying no ransom was paid.
That's like something out of a movie, right?
Yeah, what was that all about?
It's a mystery. Some people think it was his rivals trying to scare him. Others think maybe he staged the whole thing.
So we're left with more questions than answers.
Pretty much. It's one of those unsolved historical puzzles.
I wonder if it had anything to do with him stepping back from the numbers racket.
Maybe. Could have been a turning point for him.
Yeah, like he realized how dangerous that world was.
Or maybe it pushed him even more towards philanthropy, wanting to leave a positive mark.
It's like we're trying to get inside his head, understand what made him tick.
That's what makes history so intriguing, isn't it?
Okay, so we've got the rise to power, the philanthropy, the rivals, the kidnapping. But there's one thing that still bugs me. If Holstein was so important in Harlem, so loved by the community, why don't more people know about him today?
Yeah, why isn't he mentioned alongside the big names of the Harlem Renaissance?
It's a good question.
Historians have been debating this for a while, but one theory is that his criminal activities overshadowed everything else.
It's like people can't see past the bad stuff, even though he did so much good.
It's easier to celebrate the pure artists, the ones who fit our image of the Harlem Renaissance.
But by ignoring people like Holstein, aren't we missing a big part of the story?
Absolutely. We're denying the complexity, the contradictions that make history so interesting.
It's like trying to sanitize the past, make it fit our ideas of right and wrong. But history is messy. It's full of gray areas.
That's where the real stories are, in those gray areas.
So what do we do with all this information about Casper Holstein? It's a lot to process.
The first step is to just acknowledge the complexity. Right.
Yeah, don't try to put him in a box. He was both a product of his time and someone who challenged the system.
And we need to keep digging. Explore the primary sources. Listen to the voices that haven't been heard.
Like the artists he supported, the people whose lives he changed.
There's so much more to learn.
For our listeners who want to learn more, we've got some resources for you. Temples for Tomorrow. Looking back at the Harlem Renaissance is a great place to start. And if you want to dive deeper into the numbers racket, check out Black Gangs of Harlem, 1920-1939.
And don't forget about primary sources, like newspaper articles from that time or first-hand accounts.
The key is to stay curious, keep asking questions, and never stop exploring the past.
That's how we make those connections with history and with each other.
So while you're thinking about all that, we thought we'd share some perspectives from our listeners. We asked them what they thought about Casper Holstein, and their responses were really interesting.
Let's hear what they have to say.
Welcome back. It's part 3 of our deep dive. And I don't know about you, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around Casper Holstein. This guy was a numbers kingpin, but also like a champion of the Harlem Renaissance. It's a lot.
It is. He's definitely one of those figures who keeps you thinking.
Yeah, we've been talking about his philanthropy, his rivals, that whole kidnapping thing, and why he's not more well-known today.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, we asked our listeners to weigh in, share their thoughts about Holstein.
Yeah, and we got some really interesting responses.
What were some of the things people were saying?
Well, one thing that came up a lot was the connection between his illegal activities and, all the good he did. Like, did his gambling profits actually fund his philanthropy?
Right. Was he basically laundering money through good deeds?
It's a tough question, ethically speaking.
Yeah, and I've been wondering that myself. It's tempting to just connect the dots, but I don't know. It might not be that simple.
You're right. It rarely is with history. We have to remember, Holstein had other businesses too. Nightclubs, investments. It wasn't all just the Bolita.
So his wealth came from different places, not just the illegal stuff.
Exactly. And also, think about the context of the time, the Prohibition era. People's attitudes towards certain illegal activities were a bit more, shall we say, flexible.
Yeah, I mean, if the government's telling you you can't even have a drink, maybe running a numbers game doesn't seem so bad.
Especially if you're using that money to help your community.
And that's what people in Harlem saw, right? They knew where his money came from, but they still considered him a hero.
They did. It's like they viewed him as this Robin Hood figure, taking from a corrupt system and giving back to the people.
It's a complicated moral equation for sure.
It is, but it also highlights the complexities of that time period.
So people were asking about the money, but what about his contemporaries? Did they ever criticize his, criminal side?
It's a good question, and it reflects how different things were back then. Organized crime was a lot more intertwined with everyday life, especially for marginalized communities.
Right, it was like their own system of power outside of the mainstream.
Exactly, and for many, Holstein's activities were seen as a means to an end, a way to get the resources and influence needed to fight for their community.
So it's like, as long as he was using his power for good, people were okay with it.
It might sound cynical, but it does seem to fit with what we know about that era.
It's just another reminder that history isn't black and white. There are so many shades of gray.
That's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Okay, so we've talked about the money, his contemporaries, but what about the bigger picture? Why isn't Casper Holstein more famous today?
Yeah, that's the big one, and honestly, there's no easy answer. Historians are still trying to figure it out, but as we mentioned before, it's probably a few things combined.
Like, maybe his story's just too messy for the history books.
You got it. It's easier to focus on the artists and intellectuals, those who fit the traditional narrative of the Harlem Renaissance.
But by leaving out figures like Holstein, aren't we missing a big part of what the Harlem Renaissance was really about?
Absolutely, we're losing that complexity, that nuance that makes history so compelling.
It's like we're trying to create a sanitized version of the past. But the truth is, history is full of these complicated characters.
And it's in those messy, complicated stories that we often find the most interesting truths.
So what do we do with all this new knowledge about Casper Holstein?
Well, first, I think we just have to acknowledge the complexity. Don't try to put him in a box. He was both a product of his time and someone who pushed against the limits.
Right. Embrace the contradictions, the good and the bad.
Exactly. And keep the conversation going. Do your own research. Explore the primary sources.
Look for the stories of the people he helped, the artists and writers. Hear their perspectives.
There's always more to learn, more layers to uncover.
And if you're looking for a starting point, we recommend checking out Temples for Tomorrow, looking back at the Harlem Renaissance. It gives you a good overview of that period. And for a deeper dive into the world of the numbers racket, check out Black Gangs of Harlem, 1920-1939.
Those are great resources, and don't forget about primary sources like newspaper articles or first-hand accounts.
The important thing is to stay curious, keep asking questions, and never be afraid to explore the past.
Because that's how we connect with history and with each other.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from a simple Wikipedia page to a really complex and fascinating story. We've learned about Casper Holstein, the numbers kingpin, the philanthropist, the enigma. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that history is rarely simple.
It's messy, it's full of contradictions, and that's what makes it so interesting.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this thought. Embrace the complexity, don't be afraid of the messy parts, because that's where the real story lies. Thanks for joining us and keep exploring.